People often remember Paul Stanley by the glittery star painted across his face, the immortal symbol of KISS. But there is a truth few people know. Behind that mask, for decades, he always hid one ear that could never hear the world. I stood in front of tens of thousands of people, but in my childhood, I couldn't even stand in front of one child without feeling inferior. Not the words of a rock icon. It is the confession of a boy who was once mocked in the schoolyard, who learned to turn his face to the left to hide his microtia, who once believed he was born to be seen as different. In a way that was both fierce and fragile, that boy turned his wounds into art, turned his insecurity into stage lights, turned his imperfection into strength, turned an asymmetrical face into a stage legend. Paul Stanley's journey is not simply the history of a band. It is the story of a person who spent most of his life learning to look directly at himself. And finally, gently, admitting that his real face also deserves to be loved. To understand how Stanley Bert Eisen could become Paul Stanley, we must return to the cramped years when darkness did not only fill the small apartment, but also settled into every crease of his fragile self-esteem. It was there that wounds, seemingly insignificant, became the essential material shaping who he would later become. Paul Stanley was born in 1952 in a Jewish immigrant family in Upper Manhattan. In Kew Gardens, young Paul lived in an apartment that wasn't large, but was filled with sounds he could only hear halfway. When the teacher called his name, he often turned in the wrong direction. When friends joked around, he couldn't tell who was speaking. Being deaf in one ear made the world around him always out of sync. And gradually, he believed that he himself was out of sync in some way. At the playgrounds of PS 98 and then Kew Forest, children could spot weaknesses more easily than adults. They called Paul Weird Ear, laughed when he turned his head half a beat late, and some even shoved him just to see how a child they considered strange would react. Paul did not fight back, did not argue, and did not run to tell the adults. He withdrew into silence. The kind of silence of someone who does not want anyone to know they are hurting. It was that silence that made Paul an introverted, somewhat lonely child, but also opened within him a strangely delicate way of observing the world. While other children were busy being loud, Paul often stood a little farther away, watching every expression, every small hesitation in someone's voice, as if he were learning to understand everything with his eyes instead of his ears. Later, that sensitivity appeared in his singing, the way he emphasized a word, released a breath, or held out a final note, not to show off, but as if finishing the part of the story he could not speak when he was young. In the small home where his parents were busy making a living, art was the only thing that made Paul feel he was no longer different. His mother loved painting and often played classical music on weekends. Though he could not hear it fully, Paul could still sense an open space, a place where no one cared that his face was asymmetrical. Then a fateful gift appeared, a plastic guitar when he was 7. No one thought that toy would matter. But for Paul, it was the first object that did not judge his appearance, did not mock his hearing loss. When he touched the stiff plastic strings, he realized, for the first time in his life, he could create sounds of his own, no longer just a receiver of other people's sounds. From that moment, music became a door. When he received a real guitar, his world expanded with each fret. Paul spent hours in the small room, practicing again and again until his fingertips bled. But he did not feel pain, because for the first time, insecurity was no longer winning. Getting into the High School of Music and Art was proof that music was not just a refuge, but a path. In that school, among children who also carried artistic dreams, Paul was no longer seen as the boy with the strange ear. He became the young man with deep eyes, quiet, persistent, to the point where it sometimes frightened people. Every stroke he drew, every note he played, felt like a piece of armor, gentle yet resilient, protecting the fragile heart that had been wounded more than once. And from that strange blend of pain and creativity, a small seed quietly formed. The seed that would one day lead him onto a stage, put a black star over his eye, and let him be reborn as the Starchild. But before that icon could exist, Paul had to step through another door, the door between youth and adulthood, where the real challenges were only just beginning. The teenage years came to a close, and when the art school behind him became a memory, Paul stepped into the early years of adulthood in a world that was bigger, more beautiful, but also far more unforgiving. Between the late 1960s and early 1970s, while most of his peers were still confused about the future, Paul already knew clearly the one path he wanted and needed to take: the path of music. It was no longer simply a refuge from insecurity. It had become an identity, a compass needle keeping him from falling back into the darkness of his childhood. From there, he threw himself into small bands in New York, playing in sweaty rehearsal rooms, in bars filled with the smell of beer and the scraping of chairs, on stages so tiny that the only thing they illuminated was one another's faces. No spotlight, no praise, only buzzing amps and dreams still without form. But in those places where no one paid attention, Paul learned a lesson no school could teach. If you want to stand on a big stage, you must accept beginning in the dark corners where no one knows your name. Those quiet nights of performing forged in him the discipline that would later become the heart of KISS. Absolute seriousness toward the art, even when the whole world turned its back. That journey led him to a fateful meeting. Gene Simmons. Two young men, nearly complete opposites. Paul, introverted, sensitive, deeply artistic. Gene, sharp, pragmatic, ambitious to the point of coldness. Yet it was that very contrast that created a strange, gravitational pull. Each saw in the other the part they lacked. They began working together, and from their first collaboration, Wicked Lester was born. Wicked Lester did not feel like a complete band. It felt like a laboratory, where everyone pulled the music in a different direction. But for Paul, this was the first time he stepped into a project big enough to trust. When the debut album was finished in 1972, both he and Gene believed it would open the professional road they had chased through years of struggle. But that album was never released. The label rejected it. The band fell apart. 2 years of effort dissolved into nothing. If for Gene it was just a disappointment, for Paul, who had spent his whole childhood fighting to prove he was not inferior, it felt like a new crack in a self-esteem already full of scars. But this time, he did not retreat into silence like he had as a child. That failure forced him to become clearer, stronger. It taught Paul that if he wanted to create something great, he could not merely step into a band that already existed. He had to create one with a soul of its own. From the ashes of Wicked Lester, Paul and Gene did not try to patch what was broken. They wanted to create something entirely new, something they had not dared to imagine before. Early in 1973, in a small, hot, cramped rented room in New York, 4 names, Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons, Peter Criss, and Ace Frehley, stood side by side for the first time. It was such an ordinary moment that no one could have known it would later alter the flow of popular culture. They gave this new thing a name that was simple, yet bold: KISS. Short, sharp, cold, as direct as a punch to the face of a weary music industry. Paul sketched the band's logo with strong, decisive strokes, two lightning bolt S's so fierce that later, seeing them alone was enough to know Kiss had been there. But before those lightning bolts could appear, Paul endured many days grinding himself on nameless stages, dim bars, damp rehearsal rooms, performances where the audience could be counted on one hand. Nights of practice stretching until dawn, suffocating waves of disappointment after Wicked Lester's album was rejected. None of it broke him. On the contrary, it tempered in Paul a certainty rarely seen in a man barely in his 20s. He understood he had gone too far to turn back, yet not far enough to see where the road ended. To survive, he had to keep moving, but in a different direction. Those cramped, moldy days made Paul and Jean gradually realize what both had kept silent. They were not born to chase the market. They wanted to define it. What they did with Wicked Lester, trying to please the label, trying to fit the trends, no longer had a place in their thinking. If they wanted to create something great, they had to rebuild from the very ground of their failure, but with a vision bigger, bolder, and uncompromising. That awakening paved the way for everything that would happen in 1973. Paul and Jean sought out Peter Criss, a drummer with a raspy, wild voice, and Ace Frehley, a guitarist who played by instinct, free, unlike anyone else. 4 people, 4 personalities nearly impossible to reconcile. But when they stood together, when Ace's guitar slid over Jean's bass, when Peter's drums beat like a second heart, and when Paul's voice rose, an energy that had never existed before erupted. What Wicked Lester never reached now lived and breathed in that cramped little room. Among those 4 men, it was Paul who saw the clearest shape of Kiss. He understood that music alone was not enough. They needed a world, a symbol, a visual language. From that thought, Starchild was born. Starchild was not just makeup, it was a part of Paul's soul. A black star placed over his left eye, the opposite side of the malformed right ear he had spent his childhood trying to hide. But now, instead of hiding, he turned that pain into a symbol. The black star did not conceal the flaw. It overshadowed every gaze that had once scrutinized it. It was Paul's way of telling the world, I am here. Look at me. Hear me. And from that foundation, from ambition, from wounds, from passion, and an unyielding will, Kiss was officially born. Not just a band to listen to, but a phenomenon to witness. A legend beginning to glow, born from days filled with dust, fire, and dreams far larger than the tiny room that created it. When Kiss released their debut album in early 1974, Paul Stanley was not the loudest nor the most ferocious rock figure, but he was the only one who understood clearly what he was fighting for. For Paul, every note, every time he repainted his makeup, every performance in small clubs was a way to step farther from the boy once mocked for an imperfect ear. He didn't simply want success, he needed it as a way to survive. The albums Kiss and then Hotter Than Hell didn't explode immediately, but they marked the period in which Paul quietly defined his place in the band. The architect of its aesthetic, the primary songwriter, the keeper of discipline. When Ace and Peter came and went at whim, when Jean was always busy with grand plans, Paul was the one who stood at the microphone until his voice turned hoarse, the one who remeasured each angle of stage lighting to ensure every show was powerful enough for fans to remember for life. In 1975, when financial pressure pushed Kiss to the brink of collapse, Paul stepped forward like a heartbeat keeping the band from falling apart. He refined Rock and Roll All Nite until it became the declaration of all 4 members. And when Alive was recorded, under the mindset, if this fails, everything ends, Paul maintained the energy, working closely to blend the live vocals into something that truly felt like fire. The success of Alive was explosive, but for Paul, it wasn't just a commercial miracle. It was the moment he stood before a sea of people and for the first time believed that a child born with a defect could still become the center of a stage. With Destroyer came an album where Paul not only sang, but narrated. Detroit Rock City carried tragedy, precision, and a rhythm forged from years of watching life from its fringes. Producer Bob Ezrin once said Paul was the most persistent person in the studio, someone who could redo a section 20 times just so the emotion would land in the right place. But the paradox was that the brightest era of Kiss was also Paul's loneliest. While Ace and Peter spiraled into alcohol and cocaine, Paul had to become the stabilizer. Forcing himself to be strong enough for 200 shows a year, training physically to stay balanced on platform boots, changing costumes and makeup backstage over and over, then returning to a hotel room so silent it felt sharp. He once said, "I stood in the middle of a sea of people, but I had never felt so alone." As Rock and Roll Over and Love Gun arrived one after another, Paul entered his most self-possessed phase. Love Gun was the song he was proudest of, not only because of its powerful structure, but because it carried the Starchild within him. The allure, the confidence, the mastery of the stage without needing to scream. Yet behind the bright lights was a price no one saw. The moments he lost his voice but pushed himself to sing, the nights spent alone in hotel rooms until he no longer knew whether he should eat or sleep. The growing realization that the band was fracturing daily as Ace and Peter lost control of their lifestyles. And through all of this, Paul, though the frontman, was the one quietly keeping Kiss on course. 4 studio albums, 1 live album that redefined American rock, hundreds of relentless shows. All of it made Paul Stanley not just the face of Kiss, but the keeper of its soul. The one who stood firm when the others wavered. After 4 years, Kiss was no longer just a band. They were a cultural phenomenon. And Paul Stanley, for the first time in his life, felt not only seen, but truly recognized. But just as Kiss reached the height of the 70s, Paul, with the sensitive intuition of someone who had spent a lifetime observing from the edges, sensed something falling out of rhythm. The stage lights were still blazing, but beneath the platform boots and fireworks, he heard clearly the crackling of fractures. The fame was bigger, the money greater, but the atmosphere in the rehearsal room no longer resembled the days when they had only each other and a dream. Alcohol, drugs, and self-certainty began stealing what the band had once built as its foundation. By the early 1980s, the instability was no longer a premonition, but reality. Paul stepped into the new year with a familiar feeling, like his childhood, when he turned his head half a beat late and felt the world turn away. Kiss, too, was now out of sync. Peter and then Ace left one after another, leaving not only gaps in the lineup, but in Paul's own heart. The heart of someone who had always believed a band, above all, must be a family. The albums that followed reflected that imbalance. Unmasked carried a lighter, brighter tone, but lacked weight. The Elder was ambitious like an artistic manifesto, yet rejected by listeners. In every decision, Paul was the one who had to hold the spirit steady, the one who said what needed to be said when everyone else was exhausted, the one who stood in the middle of a room full of unease to defend what he had built since the days of sweating in damp rehearsal spaces. In that chaotic period, Paul revealed another kind of strength, not explosive like Starchild, but quiet and resilient, like a guitar string tightened to the perfect tension. When Creatures of the Night brought Kiss back to a heavier sound, Paul understood they had regained part of their soul, but still lacked something to truly be reborn. And then, in the midst of tense meetings, fluctuating sales, and a constantly shifting lineup, Paul and Jean confronted a truth they had avoided for too long. The makeup that had once saved them, once created a legend, had now become armor too heavy to carry. To survive, they had to do what no one in the industry had ever dared. That decision marked not only a turning point for the band, but a turning point for Paul, a man who had spent his entire life learning to face his real face. Kiss was preparing to enter the boldest moment of their career. When it seemed every effort had stabilized things, Paul realized that relying on music alone was not enough to pull the band out of the vortex. They had changed drummers, changed guitarists, changed artistic directions, but had not dared to touch the most important thing: the makeup that had become the spiritual armor of all four members. The makeup had been a symbol, but over time, it had become a barrier, preventing Kiss from reaching the new version of themselves they longed for. Paul, who had spent his childhood hiding half his face, understood this truth more deeply than anyone. He carried Starchild like a spell, like a form of self-healing. But he also knew clearly, if they continued hiding behind that makeup, they would remain trapped between nostalgia and fear of change. His own fear. When the idea of removing the makeup came to the table, Paul no longer stepped back. As someone who had once feared people's gaze, he was now the one determined to step into the light first. One of the boldest decisions in rock history was made: the choice to remove the final layer of armor. When Kiss appeared on MTV in 1983, there were no more black and white patterns, no more sharp lines, only four real faces exposed to the camera. In that moment, Paul felt all his old emotions surge back. The awkwardness of a child who once turned his head to hide his right ear, the anxiety of wondering whether people would accept his real face. He later said, "Taking off the makeup was like stepping into the light with my real face, something I feared all through childhood. But something unexpected happened. Instead of losing their magic, they found a new life." When Kiss released their debut album in early 1974, Paul Stanley was not the loudest nor the fiercest rock archetype, but he was the only one who understood very clearly what he was fighting for. For Paul, every note, every time he repainted his makeup, every performance in small clubs was a way to move further away from the boy who had been mocked for an imperfect ear. He did not merely want success. He needed it as a way to survive. The albums Kiss and then Hotter Than Hell did not explode immediately, but they became the period in which Paul quietly positioned himself within the band, the builder of its aesthetic, the principal songwriter, the keeper of discipline. When Ace and Peter came and went on whims, when Jean was always busy with grand plans, Paul was the one who stood at the microphone until his voice turned hoarse, the one who remeasured every angle of stage lighting to ensure that each show would be unforgettable for the audience. In 1975, when financial pressure pushed Kiss to the brink of collapse, Paul stepped up like a heartbeat, keeping the band from falling apart. He revised Rock and Roll All Nite until it became the declaration of all four members. And When Alive was recorded in Bound to Be Key. In the mindset of if it fails, everything ends, Paul kept the energy, working closely so the live vocals would blend into something that truly burned. The success of Alive exploded, but for Paul it was not merely a commercial miracle. It was the moment he stood before a sea of people and for the first time believed that a child born with a defect could still become the center of the stage. With Destroyer, an album in which Paul not only sang, but also narrated. Detroit Rock City carried the breath of tragedy, precision, and rhythms forged from years of observing life from the margins. Producer Bob Ezrin once said Paul was the most persistent person in the studio, someone who could sing a passage 20 times just to place the emotion exactly right. But the paradox was that Kiss's most brilliant era was also Paul's loneliest. While Ace and Peter were drawn into alcohol and cocaine, Paul had to become the organizer, forcing himself to be fit enough for 200 shows a year, training his body to stand steady in platform boots, changing costumes and masks repeatedly backstage, and finally returning to hotel rooms so silent they felt chilling. He once said, "I stood among a sea of people, but I had never felt so alone." When Rock and Roll Over and Love Gun were released one after another, Paul entered his most autonomous phase. Love Gun was the song he was proudest of, not only for its powerful structure, but because it contained the Starchild within him. Seduction, confidence, and the feeling of mastering the stage without needing to scream. Yet behind the dazzling lights was a price no one saw. The times his voice failed, but he forced himself to keep singing. The nights alone in hotel rooms until he did not know whether to eat or sleep. The moments he realized the band was fracturing day by day as Ace and Peter lost control of their lives. And through all of that, Paul, though the front man, remained the one silently keeping Kiss on course. 4 studio albums, 1 live album that redefined American rock, hundreds of relentless nights on stage. All of it made Paul Stanley not only the face of Kiss, but the keeper of Kiss's soul, the one who stood upright when others faltered. After 4 years, Kiss was no longer merely a band. They were a cultural phenomenon, and Paul Stanley, for the first time in his life, felt he was not only seen, but truly recognized. But just as Kiss stood at the highest heights of the 1970s, Paul, with the sensitive instinct of someone who had long observed the world from the sidelines, soon sensed something beginning to go out of sync. The stage lights were still brilliant, but beneath the platform boots and the pyrotechnics, he could clearly hear the rustling of cracks. Fame grew, money increased, but the mood in the rehearsal room no longer resembled the time when they only had each other and a dream. Alcohol, stimulants, self-satisfaction all began to take away what the band had once set as its foundation. By the early 1980s, that wobble was no longer a premonition, but reality. Paul crossed into the new year with a familiar feeling. Like in childhood, when he turned his head half a beat late and felt the world turn away, Kiss now was also out of sync. Peter then Ace left one after another, leaving gaps not only in the lineup, but in Paul's own heart. The heart of someone who had always believed a band, above all, must be a family. The subsequent albums reflected that imbalance. Unmasked carried a lighter, brighter tone, but lacked weight. The Elder was as ambitious as an artistic manifesto, but was rejected by audiences. In every decision, Paul was the one who had to hold the spirit firm, the one to say what needed to be said when everyone else was tired, the one who stood in the middle of a room full of unease to protect what he had built since the days of sweating in damp rehearsal spaces. In that chaotic period, Paul revealed another kind of strength, not explosive like Starchild, but quiet and durable, like a guitar string tightened to the right tension. When Creatures of the Night brought Kiss back to a heavy sound, Paul understood they had regained part of their soul, but still lacked something to truly be reborn. Then, amid tense meetings, fluctuating sales, and a constantly changing lineup, Paul and Gene faced the truth they had avoided too long. The makeup that had once saved them and created a legend had become a spiritual armor too heavy to bear. To survive, they had to do what no one in the industry had dared to do. That decision marked not only a turning point for the band, but a turning point for Paul, a man who had spent his life learning to face his real face. Kiss was preparing for the boldest moment of their career. When it seemed every effort had temporarily stabilized things, Paul realized that music alone was not enough to pull the band out of the swamp. They had changed drummers, changed guitarists, changed artistic direction, but still had not dared touch the most important thing, the makeup that had become the spiritual armor of all four members. Makeup had been a symbol, but over time it became a barrier preventing Kiss from reaching the new version of themselves they craved. Paul, who had hidden half his face throughout childhood, understood this truth more deeply than anyone. He wore Starchild like a magic, like a method of self-healing, but he also knew clearly, if they continued hiding behind that makeup, they would forever be stuck between nostalgia and the fear of change. His own fear. When the idea of removing the makeup was placed on the table, Paul no longer stepped back. As someone who had once feared the gaze of others, he became the one determined to step into the light first. One of the boldest decisions in rock history was made, the choice to shed the final armor. When Kiss appeared on MTV in 1983, there were no more black and white patches, no more sharp lines. Only 4 real faces exposed to the camera. In that moment, Paul felt all his old emotions resurface. The awkwardness of a child who once turned his head to hide his right ear, the anxiety about whether people would accept his real face. He later said, "Taking off the makeup was like stepping into the light with my real face, something I had feared throughout childhood." But the unexpected happened. Instead of losing their magic, they found a different vitality. Lick It Up, the first album without makeup, was released in 1983, immediately making a strong mark and pushing Kiss back onto the rock map. That success was like an affirmation that the band did not exist merely because of masks. They existed because of music, because of persistence, and because of the ability to be reborn. Kiss had bet everything and won. And Paul Stanley, for the first time in his life, stood before the world with his real face and realized he did not need to hide to be seen anymore. But that victory was not the end. It was only a sigh before a harsher journey began. For as soon as the new door opened after Lick It Up, Paul understood the real challenge awaiting him. Without the protective layer of makeup, every flaw that stage lights once hid became ruthlessly clear. A missed note, a momentary lapse in focus, a furrowed brow when his voice began to tire. But that exposure placed Paul in a position he had never officially held, the balancer for the ship called Kiss. If previously the band relied on stage personas, now they relied on him. From 1983 to the late 80s, Paul became the quiet but steady compass. New albums appeared continuously as affirmations that Kiss had not disappeared. They were transforming. Animalize carried the breathless urgency of the rising metal era. Asylum was colorful and bold in the glam spirit. Crazy Nights reached toward global appeal, while Hot in the Shade was quieter, more mature, like a long sigh amid the decade's whirlwind. In all of them, Paul's hand was evident, from song structure to guitar arrangements to stage color. He was not only the frontman, he was the thread connecting scattered pieces. But the more responsibility he carried, the higher the price. When Gene Simmons poured energy into film and personal projects, Paul nearly bore the entire weight of Kiss. He was the one who turned the studio lights on earliest and off latest, the one who resolved every disturbance as members changed, the one who kept Kiss from slipping away from its identity amid the blazing glam metal market. To the public, Paul was a powerful icon, but behind the wings, he was merely an exhausted man trying to hold everything from collapsing. Then, amid mountains of pressure, Paul returned to his starting point. Raw music without armor, without fireworks. In the late 80s, he began small solo nights. No dazzling lights, no pyrotechnics, no platform boots, no Starchild persona. There was only him, a guitar, and people who truly wanted to hear Paul Stanley in the most honest way. No one demanded he be a legend. No one required him to be invincible. He only needed to be himself. In those humble nights, Paul rediscovered the pulse he had lost in Kiss's whirlwind, the feeling of singing without having to prove anything, the feeling of the boy who once sat in a small room, holding a plastic guitar and believing music could be the way out of the dark. For many, it was just a transitional phase. But for Paul Stanley, it was a quiet rebirth. The moment he learned to stand without a mask, without pyrotechnics, relying only on his own heart. In the late 80s and early 90s, Paul passed through successive trials by fire, and each time he emerged, he shed another layer of hardness to get closer to the person inside. As Kiss gradually stabilized with a new lineup, as Gene returned to focus on the band, and as the 1990s opened with a turbulent music market, Paul, at the most mature stage of his career, faced another crossroads. Not a musical fork, but a turn that redefined himself. He had steered Kiss through glam metal, through MTV, through brutal tours. But the further he went, the more he realized a rock career, however grand, could not answer the quiet questions that had followed him since childhood. Who am I truly when the lights go out? Behind the mask, behind Starchild, behind the roar of thousands, what remains? As if fate had sketched a new turn, 1999 appeared before him like an entirely different door. Paul Stanley stepped onto a stage without electric guitar, without pyrotechnics, without glittering tight outfits, onto the stage of the Phantom of the Opera in Toronto. A world of theater, of iron discipline, of singing that demanded emotional depth more than brute force, of characters who live by inner life rather than stage explosions. From May 25 to August 1st, then from September 30 to October 31st, 1999, Paul embodied the Phantom, a man bearing an external wound, hiding behind a mask, craving love but afraid to be seen. A character for which perhaps no one was more fitting than a person who had carried that pain in real life. Paul did not act the Phantom. He understood the Phantom. In every moment on stage, there was the trembling of the boy who once turned his face to hide his right ear. There was the loneliness of the young man who practiced until his fingertips bled to forget the taunts. There was anger, vulnerability, a yearning to be acknowledged, life fragments Paul had carried for nearly 50 years. Through living that role, Paul finally did something he had avoided throughout his career. He openly spoke about microtia, the deformity of his right ear that he had hidden almost his entire life. That honesty not only freed him from old shame, but also helped thousands of people living with facial differences realize they were not alone. Paul became a spokesperson for the Canadian organization, AboutFace, spending time meeting children and parents, talking about pain he knew all too well. At nearly 50, Paul Stanley had not only reinvented his image as an artist through the challenging role of the Phantom, he had recreated the person behind the artist, so that for the first time, it was not Starchild or the frontman, but Paul who stood in the light. When the curtain fell in Toronto, Paul carried with him something he had not touched for decades, the feeling of being acknowledged by his real face without the need for powder. That piece opened a new journey, slower, deeper, but more mature than ever. Entering the early 2000s, Paul gradually recognized that his body and heart had grown weary from the years running with Kiss. Thousands of nights, the jumps in heavy platform boots, the screams through pyrotechnics, all left marks that stage lights could not erase. But instead of fleeing, Paul chose to confront them by returning to the one thing that had always been honest with him: unadorned music, without armor, without symbols. Live to Win 2006 was that comeback. In his 50s, Paul wrote songs no longer to set the stage on fire, but to answer the quiet questions inside himself. The album rings with the calm of someone who had fallen many times, yet still rose. When the title track unexpectedly spread, thanks to South Park, the public realized Paul was no longer merely a rock icon. He was a storyteller using his wounds and resilience. But life was never easy for him. In 2007, a body that had endured decades of overuse suddenly warned him. His heart went into arrhythmia, forcing hospitalization just before a show. Paul, who once flew above 20,000 fans on stage by cable, now lay under white hospital lights. That moment reminded him even a legend has limits. His body was no longer the endless machine of the 70s. As always, Paul did not let fear beat him. 1 year later, he stood on stage with One Live Kiss, 2008. An intimacy that contrasted sharply with Kiss's usual spectacles. No smoke, no pyrotechnics, only a voice rich with experience and a heart that had weathered enough to know true connection needs no special effects. For the first time, the audience saw a Paul so intimate, still strong, but tender in the way of a man who understands the value of fragility. While Paul rediscovered himself, Kiss also regained vitality. Sonic Boom, 2009, arrived as a statement that the band still had power after more than 3 decades. The album topped the Billboard Hard Rock chart, opening a rare era of revival for a long-standing group. 3 years later, Monster, 2012, reaffirmed that, strong, sharp, preserving the spirit of classic rock while still sounding fresh. At the center of that revival was Paul, who steered Kiss through each change without letting the band lose its soul. That glory was set in stone in 2014 when Kiss were officially inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That moment not only honored the band's success, it honored the journey Paul had led with his whole heart. A journey that began with a frightened boy, passed through hundreds of lonely nights, and ended with a man standing before the world with the posture of someone who had never surrendered. Paul Stanley never stopped at a fixed chapter. While many artists of his generation retreated backstage, he opened an entirely new path. From 2015, he formed Soul Station, an R&B soul project with nearly 15 musicians, where Paul sang the melodies he grew up with. The Motown records that once comforted the young Paul. On that stage, he no longer needed platform boots, pyrotechnics, or the star on his face. There was only his voice and the truth. Now and then is the crystallization of all that. A man who once lived behind a mask, now standing in the light without fear. Paul Stanley finally became the most complete version of himself. Of course, that journey did not avoid scars. The tachycardia in 2007 was only one of many warnings. Hip surgeries, the consequence of thousands of nights standing in heavy shoes, and procedures to protect his vocal cords are the price Paul was willing to pay. He never treated them as tragedies, but as proof that he had fully lived every moment on stage. Entering his 60s, Paul no longer fought to prove he deserved to be on stage. He sang, painted, loved his family, and lived more slowly. Like a man who finally learned to see the value in the face that once made him fear the gaze of others. This is a calmer chapter, but deeper. The chapter in which Paul Stanley, after half a century of wearing Paul Stanley, once said that success never filled the emptiness of a heart wounded in childhood. Perhaps that is why a man who stood before tens of thousands could still tremble when stepping into the roles of husband and father. In the early 1990s, while Kiss still burned bright with tours and raucous albums, Paul sought something entirely different. a home warm enough to soothe the silence after the stage. His marriage to Pamela Bowen came very naturally, quietly, not blown up like the rocker romances you often hear. Paul still carried old insecurities and the desire for a place to belong, a place that did not demand he shine or hide behind the star makeup. The birth of Evan in 1994 made Paul feel pure happiness for the first time. Holding his son, he felt he could love without having to prove anything, without needing to be great to deserve this life. But deep scars in the soul don't vanish, simply because one has a child. Career pulled Paul away, and the fear of abandonment, the wound from being teased as a child for his deformed ear, still made him unconsciously keep distance from those he loved. Small differences in daily life gradually became larger gaps, and Paul realized that kindness, effort, or love could not save a marriage when he himself didn't yet know how to stand firm in it. The 2001 divorce was not dramatic, but behind that silence was a shrinking Paul, a man who looked in the mirror and saw himself like that child once more, frightened, hollow, and unsure whether he was worthy of being loved again. There were nights after the divorce when Paul returned to a large house and only heard the air conditioner running in the dark. That silence weighed so heavily that it woke him many times at night, feeling as if he were drifting in emptiness. He called Evan every night, not because his son needed to hear his voice, but because he needed a reason to feel he still belonged to someone. It was also during those days that Paul began therapy, a difficult but necessary decision, because he did not want old wounds to spill over into the next generation. That period made Paul understand that sometimes the hardest thing to confront is not the stage lights, but oneself in the dark. Life turned gently when Erin Sutton appeared. Her warmth did not arrive like a storm. It came softly like a breeze opening a door, making Paul feel peace for the first time when beside someone he did not need to hide his anxieties from. In their early conversations, Paul told her about microtia, something he had treated as his ugliest secret for decades. Erin listened, understood, and did not change the way she looked at him. That moment brought Paul to tears, because he knew he was standing before someone who could love him not for the stage lights, but for his true self. The 2005 wedding was not extravagant, but for Paul it was the first step into a life chapter where he could be himself, without the Starchild armor. The birth of Colin, then Sarah, then Emily lit up their small home in a way Paul had never dared to dream. Watching a daughter take her first steps, or hearing Evan practice guitar, Paul felt a calm spread through him like warm water, a feeling the stage had never given. In Paul's weakest health years, Erin was always there as a quiet anchor. When he returned from tour with legs aching so much he had to sit on the floor, she did not blame or panic. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder, waited for him to breathe out a long sigh, and then said, "I'm here." No philosophy, no reassurances. Just a short sentence that, for the man who had lived half his life half true behind makeup, had more healing power than any therapy. When Paul prepared for hip surgery, his biggest fear was not the scalpel or recovery, but an invisible dread. If his body could no longer perform the signature spins on stage, would the audience still see him the same way? Erin, always understanding the anxieties Paul hid, whispered, "People love you for your heart, not your shoes." For a man who lived half his life half real behind makeup, that phrase healed more than any treatment. When Paul could not sing after a vocal surgery, Erin read him books so his voice could rest. When he was exhausted and sat silently for hours in the living room from hip pain, she did not ask much, only put on soft music and draped a coat over his legs. When Paul first played her a demo from Live to Win, Erin listened as if it were the first time she had heard him sing, a sincerity that made him feel he was not just an artist, but a man allowed to be tired, allowed to lean on someone. That peace seeped into Paul's life through seemingly small moments. Morning routines of making milk, afternoons taking children to school, evenings the whole family watching a movie in the living room. All those simple things became parts of life Paul never knew he needed. Each small moment was like a bandage over an old wound. The children did not know their father once trembled before a mirror as a child, did not know he had worn a mask to hide half his face for decades. They only knew a dad who tied his hair neatly, liked to listen to them practice, and always took family photos at holidays. Paul and Erin chose to raise their children in both traditions, Jewish and Catholic, not to tie them to one identity, but because Paul understood the world had more than one answer. What he most wanted was not for the children to believe in something, but how they treated others. For Paul, family was not only a place of healing, it was where he learned to become the kind of man he had always wanted to be as a boy, but had no one to guide him. Evan grew up pursuing the arts, and each time Paul watched his son perform, he felt pride mixed with a slight sadness. He once said, "I only want him to know he doesn't have to become me or surpass me. He just needs to be himself." Those words echoed like a response to a long life of Paul, wondering if he was good enough. The arrival of the second family did not erase the past, but it made the past less sharp. A man who once lived behind a mask finally learned to step into the light with his real face. Right there in the kitchen, the living room, the backyard of a house where 3 children ran around, and Erin smiled at Paul as if he had never been a legend who needed to hide anything. Family didn't turn Paul into someone else. It allowed him to become the fullest version of who he already was. Perhaps that is the quietest yet deepest truth in the journey of someone who once believed he was born different. When his home finally felt solid, Paul looked back on the life behind him as if observing a long road filled with old footprints. What he left for the world doesn't sit in a glass case of trophies. It lives in countless corners, on roaring stages, in paintings full of breath, in the moments when audiences burst into laughter, and in letters from parents whose children share the same facial condition he once carried. In music, people often mention the 100 million records Kiss sold as undeniable proof of their influence. But for Paul, those numbers were never the essence of success. What he truly believed in lay within the melodies he wrote. Love Gun, Detroit Rock City, I Was Made for Lovin' You, Black Diamond. These songs aren't just tied to the history of rock. They're tied to the coming-of-age moments of generations, emotional milestones people return to whenever they need strength. Listening to them, audiences feel the presence of someone who once stood on the edges of life, observing the world with perceptive eyes, and who found in music the first life raft he ever grabbed. Kiss, the name he and Gene sparked out of failure, carries Paul's imprint in ways words rarely capture. The logo he sketched in a cheap little room in 1973, just bold, straight pen strokes, became one of the most recognizable symbols of the 20th century. The Starchild design, with the black star over the left eye, was once a stage highlight, but for those who know Paul's story, it is a whisper of the past, of a boy who once turned his face to hide a deformed ear. When millions dress as Starchild for Halloween, they're carrying a piece of Paul's story on their faces, the story of turning pain into power. Away from the stage's explosions, Paul opened another door. His vision helped turn Kiss into one of the most widely licensed music brands in the world, with over 2,000 products. He co-founded Rock and Brews, a restaurant chain expanding worldwide, not to inflate a rock star image, but to build joyful gathering places for people. It is another side of Paul where ambition meets the warmth of family, surprising many who thought they already understood him. In painting, he appears in a different palette, quieter, deeper. Wide, bold strokes that still tremble at certain points, welcomed enthusiastically by collectors. Some say they see in them parts of Paul's life he never put into words, the bruises, the rising again, the wavering moments before life itself. Perhaps the most beautiful thing lies in how Paul faces his past with gentleness. After publicly sharing his microtia story during his phantom years, he became a partner to AboutFace, an organization supporting children with facial differences. He didn't stand there as a star. He stood there as someone who had lived the exact pain those children were feeling. When he said he had spent years hiding half his face, the room fell silent. Not from pity, but from the simple courage of a man speaking for the child he once was. Working with AboutFace wasn't an end point, but a beginning. From there, Paul expanded his healing journey in deeper ways. His work with the HOUSE Research Institute started from the same profound empathy. He knows what it's like to hear the world incompletely, and he wants the next generation not to endure the same. When he talks about hearing protection, people don't hear a spokesperson. They hear a heart once betrayed by sound. Looking at that journey, one doesn't see a legend chasing immortality. One sees a man who lived by discipline, kindness, and a style of bravery that never needed display. A man who left his mark by always finishing what he started, always loving to the end, always staying gracious, even when no one was watching. Some artists leave noise, some leave music. Paul, he leaves a feeling that a child once afraid to look into the mirror can become a pillar for millions, a feeling that kindness is not weakness, a feeling that healing can be stronger than any stage. Those marks aren't flashy, like fireworks bursting above an arena, but warm and steady, like a small ember capable of heating the years long after applause has faded. From that piece, Paul finally understood what decades under lights never taught him. Some wounds only close when we are seen as human, not as legends. When the final curtain of the end of the road tour came down, he stepped into a different rhythm of life, not retreating backward, but moving into the part of life he had unconsciously delayed, the part for breathing, for family, for moments that need no proof. Mornings in Beverly Hills were so gentle that Paul sometimes had to pause and check if they were real. Sunlight quietly touching the easel, the sound of children running on the stairs, Aaron asking him to bring tea to the porch. None of it was loud, yet all of it felt right for the man Paul had become. It was a peace he chose, not one forced by age. Only a person who has lived in the storm of a stage knows the value of a day without explosions. Cycling through the soft hills brought another strange feeling. Not escaping pressure, but hearing where he was going. After decades of bracing himself before crowds, Paul savored the feeling of no one demanding anything. Only wind, breath, and a slow heartbeat. In the studio, where the smell of paint and wood mingles with the light from outside, his colors bloom as if breathing for the first time. No obligation to dazzle. Painting has become a way of being honest with himself. And Soul Station keeps his music soft, like the sound the young boy he once was longed to hear when the world reached him only halfway. This moment in life isn't an ending, but a gentle kind of maturity. After Starchild, after Kiss, after metal armor and heavy platform boots, Paul stands in the light without needing a black star to hide behind. And unexpectedly, his real face, the one he once feared, turns out to be enough. kind enough, strong enough, beautiful enough to stay. Looking back at Paul Stanley's journey, we see glimpses of ourselves. The parts we hide because we think they're ugly, the nights spent wondering if we're enough, the moments when we feel we must stiffen up just to be accepted. Paul didn't teach us how to be extraordinary. He showed us that sometimes the most extraordinary thing is daring to show up exactly as we are. If Kiss's music once shook the world, Paul's life story leaves a different kind of echo, a warmth that makes us want to live slower, be kinder, be strong in the softest way. That's why even though the Starchild makeup has long come off, the star has never dimmed. It simply moved. From his painted eye to the hearts of those who see themselves in Paul's journey of wounds and hope. And if you've read to the end of this story, perhaps you too carry a real face that once hesitated in front of the mirror. I hope Paul's journey helps you be gentler with yourself, to know you don't need to be perfect to deserve love, to be seen, to be heard. What do you feel when you think about Paul Stanley? Which part of his story resonates with you the most? I would really love to hear you share, because sometimes a healing journey begins with a very small sentence.